Hello, my friends. Welcome. My name is Joe. This is the Joe Martino Show. Today, I want to have a conversation with you about how hard it is to have hard conversations. What's the cost of not having those hard conversations? What's the benefit of having them? And how might we decide how we engage in those? Let's kick it off. This is the Joe Martino Show.
You're listening to the Joe Martino Show, a podcast dealing with all things emotional, relational, and human nature. Joe is a licensed counselor in the state of Michigan, specializing in relationship therapy. He is also the author of the book, The Emotionally Secure Couple. All advice offered in this episode is offered for entertainment and educational purposes only. Enjoy the show.
If you haven't already, you may want to sign up for my blog, the Emotionally Climbed blog. You can do that at joemartino.com by going to iamjoemartino.substack.com. And the reason I do that is because Substack does not charge me an arm and a leg to be able to make sure that I get my content out to you, and we will be releasing things through there. Also, people who sign up will get one-sheet PDFs and that type of thing sent directly to them that are not available to the general public. So that's something to consider. What I want to talk to you about today is the high cost of avoiding hard conversations. What actually happens to our emotional peace when we actually try to buy it through silence? What happens? What's the cost of buying emotional peace through silence? And here's my basic idea on this, my basic thought that kind of drives this conversation in my head, and now that I'm hoping to share with you to create a conversation in your head. A lot of people say they want peace. What they actually want is quiet, or more accurately, they want the false feeling that comes from the absence of conflict. So they avoid the conversation. They let things slide. They stay nice. And if you've been here for any amount of time, you know that I'm not a big fan of that as an approach to how we live life. Because here's the thing, for a while that works. For a while, that opportunity, that strategy works. The tension goes down, anxiety settles, and there is a false sense of calm. But the peace isn't free. It just is sending a delayed bill. It's akin to the idea of buy now, pay later, but you know you're going to pay more than if you could just buy now and pay now. So what I want to talk to you about today is the reality that avoiding hard conversations is one of the most expensive habits that we have. What is the actual cost of buying peace with silence? That's what I want to talk to you about. Because avoiding hard conversations, it often feels like relief. Our bodies calm down. Your body will literally calm down because all the peace is gone. And I run into couples like this all the time. Well, we're not fighting anymore. Sure, because the conflict went away because you stopped engaging. You tell yourself, well, it's not worth it. I don't need to have that conversation. It's not worth it. I cannot tell you how many times people sit in my office and they're like, yeah, I just had to decide it isn't worth it. And what makes this so difficult, what makes this such a tricky wrestle is the reality that sometimes it really isn't worth it. There are times where I'm upset and I just need to eat something, or I just need to drink something because I'm dehydrated, or I just need to take a nap, or I just need to recognize that I'm actually frustrated about this thing over here, and whoever's right here in front of me is a much easier thing for me, a much easier object for me to turn my anger towards. But what about when it's actually something going on? And I see this a lot. I see this with people who are married to highly volatile, highly verbally manipulative and mean people. They'll say, well, I just had to decide that it wasn't worth it. And here's the thing, when they decide that, things go away. Things get better for the short run. But nothing actually disappeared. Nothing actually went away. Everything just kind of went underground. Everything just kind of got stuffed into a balloon. We essentially created a ticking time bomb. So today we're going to talk about what emotional peace really costs when it is purchased through avoidance, and then what do we do about it? Because here's the thing, silence feels like peace. Avoidance works in the short term because it reduces immediate discomfort, and the diminishment of immediate discomfort feels like peace. There's no conflict, no risk, no awkwardness. Your nervous system reads that as safety. And if you've been listening, a few weeks ago, I kind of made fun of what seems to be everybody's new, my dysregulated nervous system. Sure, but we have to ask ourselves, maybe your nervous system is right here in being dialed up. Because what you're actually doing is we're choosing short-term regulation over long-term health. short-term regulation over long-term health. You are calming in the moment at the expense of the relationship. And I don't know how else to say that. You're choosing calm right now, but what you're actually doing is you're allowing poison to run through the veins of the relationship, and you're guaranteeing illness, you're guaranteeing sickness, you're guaranteeing emotional unhealth, and in many cases, you're probably certainly putting the relationship at risk of being destroyed. Unresolved friction or conflict is not the same as removed conflict or friction. In fact, removed conflict or friction isn't the same as just pretending it isn't there. And most of the time, when we avoid the hard conversation, that's what we do. We try to pretend that it didn't happen, that it didn't exist, that you didn't feel whatever it is you felt. And so what happens is you start to chase, again, getting to that spot. Remember, our brains wire ourselves to do whatever they just did quicker. And so if you decide that the solution to your problem is to pretend that there was no friction, and that brought you temporary relief, the next time it's going to be harder to have the hard conversation because your brain's going to remember, well, back there I didn't feel it. And it's going to ignore whatever the consequences of that was. Whatever the consequences that was brought into your life because you chose to ignore the hard conversation, most of the time our brain will ignore that in the moment of a decision when we're trying to decide about the next hard conversation. And here's the thing, avoidance always charges interest. It always does. If we avoid things, we're going to end up having to deal with the original issue plus interest. We're going to have resentment that will build slowly. And you're always responsible for your resentment. If you have resentment right now, you're responsible for it. Emotional distance that no one can quite explain. You ever been there? We just don't feel connected. Well, why don't you feel connected? Because we avoid the hard conversation. I see this with couples. And sometimes it's because somebody isn't safe to have the conversation with. But that's a different way of avoiding the hard conversation. One of the things that's most interesting is we tend to think that only the people who pretend that there isn't a hard conversation are the ones who are avoiding the hard conversation. But that's not accurate. There are also the people who they're avoiding the hard conversation by just blowing it up. They just blow it up and they're not safe. So when someone comes to them with a hard conversation, they blow it up for their own safety. And in so doing, they avoid the next hard conversation. Which brings us to the next kind of cost of avoiding the hard conversation. A lot of times, people who consistently avoid hard conversations, either by not having them or by setting them on fire, they lose self-respect because they didn't handle it the way it should have been handled when it mattered. Either they didn't speak when they should have, or they didn't listen when they should have. And that becomes a very difficult place to live because you run with that story in your head going like a movie just caught on loop again and again and again. When my children were young, the Batman Lego movie came out. And I could quote the entire movie without ever having seen it because it played on DVD in my wife's Yukon every time we were in the car. And I could quote the movie without ever having actually seen it because it was just always running. That's what happens in our brain when we refuse to have the hard conversation. The fallout of that runs in our head like that movie on loop, just nonstop. And we have to accept that is the price we pay for avoiding the hard conversation. One of the more interesting consequences of not having the hard conversation is we mire the other person in the slog of confusion. We essentially put their feet in mud and we wonder why they're not running because they don't know what's going on because we've not had the hard conversation with them. They don't know why you're mad. They don't know why you're resenting them. They don't understand it. And unless it's like, well, they should. And partly because we misunderstand and empathy. And if you want to hear more about that, I did deal with that in episode 334, the episode right before this one, where we talk about the difference between empathy, where I talk about the difference between empathy and boundaries. And so what happens is the person's confused because they never got actually clear feedback from you on what it is you want. So they're operating the way that they think everything's good to go. I see this a ton in couples where one person thought the other person was going to change once they got married. Or they got together at a stage of their life where they both had a lot of dysfunction. One got healthy as far as whatever the dysfunction was. Let's say that they both did a lot of maybe recreational drugs. So not hardcore stuff, but they both did a lot of weed. They both did a lot of partying. And then one of them decides, okay, I'm going to grow up and not do that anymore. But they don't ever tell the other person that they're expecting them to grow up and not do that anymore too. And so then what happens, they're kind of running out this distress of, well, why aren't you changing? But the other person thinks that they're doing exactly what they're supposed to be doing because that's how the relationship started. You will see this a ton. If you become a couples therapist, you will see that a ton. And a lot of people, they end up coming to counseling because they've just never had the hard conversation of, I need you to change. I need you to grow. I need this behavior to stop. I need this behavior to start. And so they're buying peace because they don't want the other person to feel bad or whatever it is. And what happens is they get caught because the other person then has a ton of feelings about feeling they're just stuck and confused. And what happens is the person and couple or relationship ends up going on this repeated pattern of doing the same thing again and again and again and again and again and again and again. Are you upset or annoyed by the agains yet? Because that's how they feel. And maybe you recognize that because if you're living that out in your life, that's probably how you feel. Because you can't avoid the conversation forever. You can postpone it, but that just makes the conversation when you actually have it heavier. Now, I do want to take just a brief moment here and step back and say there is a difference between avoiding the conversation and intentionally choosing when you as a unit have the conversation. And I use the word unit there as opposed to couple because this is not just true for couples. This can be true for a coworker. This can be true for your friend. In other words, hey, we need to talk about this. And right now doesn't seem like a good time. When would be a good time? That's a unified decision. Sometimes you're going to make that decision on your own. I know I'm tired. I know I just worked a double. I know that there's been a lot of hard things lately. And I know I need a good night's sleep and a snack before I engage in this conversation, or breakfast if it's really a good night's sleep. Whatever it is, that's fine. You can make that choice. But sometimes it's helpful to go to the person and say, hey, we need to talk about this. When would work for you? That's not avoiding. That's being strategic. We operate off of this myth about keeping the peace. We believe that keeping the peace is somehow like we're just going to avoid any distress, any discomfort. And really what we typically mean by keeping the peace is that we will keep the peace so we're going to keep the peace by keeping other people comfortable or ourselves comfortable at the expense of the relationship. Because sometimes we kind of scam ourselves. Pretend like we're doing this to keep the other person comfortable. We pretend like we're doing this so that the other person doesn't feel upset. We pretend like we're doing this because we don't want the other person to feel bad about themselves. And in reality, we don't want to deal with the fallout of them getting mad, of them feeling some sort of way, as one of my friends will often say would be the correct grammar there. We pretend it's about them, but really it's about us. And that's not actually keeping the peace. Real peace is not the absence of conflict. It's conflict that is processed in the presence of honesty. Real conflict is not the absence of real conflict. Real peace is not the absence of conflict. It's processed conflict in the presence of honesty. In other words, being honest with what's going on. Because what we want to say, hey, this is what's going on, and this is how I think we would solve it. How do you think you would solve it? Like, let's have this hard conversation. Because if your peace requires silence, it usually means someone is carrying more than their share of the emotional load. If your peace requires silence, it usually means that manipulation has entered the conversation and the DNA of the relationship. If your peace requires silence, your peace is actually poison. It's not health. Because that's not peace. It's imbalance and it's unhealthiness. It's toxic. And so when that happens, we have to step back and be like, okay, well, wait, what's actually going on here? How do I create health? One of the ways that we create health is we have the hard conversations. I've said this, a lot on this show. I went to the doctor just a few days ago. I don't go to the doctor hoping that they're going to tell me something that is more palatable than what's actually wrong with me. Right? I don't need my doctor to worry about my feelings as much as I need them to worry about my health. And so if I have a problem, they need to tell me, hey, that's unhealthy. And that's what happens in a relationship is we tend to say, oh, wait, they're not doing something. Well, I don't want to be mad. I see this with parents and their adult children. I feel like what they're doing isn't very healthy, but I don't want to say anything because they might get mad. And you see the lie there, right? I'm worried about them getting mad, Well, it's not really a lie. Maybe it's a lie. At the very least, it's a self-scam. Because you're worried about what they'll do when they get mad at you. That's not healthy. And that's really hard, but it's also very, very true. And here's the reason that hard conversations feel so dangerous. Because if your adult child gets mad at you, you might not see your grandkids. You might not see them. And sometimes you have to make that choice. Is this enough of a problem that I'm willing to risk my child talking to me or me not seeing my grandchildren? You have to run that out. Now, if it's your child in your house, you probably have to risk that, right? Like you're going to have to risk some hard conversations with your minor children that you might not risk with your adult children. You got to decide, is this something that I think is actually unhealthy for them, or is it a preference? But one of the problems is hard conversations, because we don't practice them, this problem actually gets exacerbated. But hard conversations threaten the very things that we care about and we don't want to lose. They can threaten our approval. They can threaten our connection with the person that we're talking to. And this is probably the biggest one. They threaten our connection with the people that we're trying to talk to, or potentially, because very few people have developed an ability to endure a hard conversation. That's why when I have this conversation, I try to make sure I talk about the hearer and the listener as much as I talk about the speaker, because both sides are required to endure a hard conversation. But they can threaten a lot of things. They can threaten your identity. They can threaten the stability that you feel in your life. A lot of times, like with wives and husbands, they can literally threaten livelihoods. They can threaten the marriage. Listen, this is an aside, a little bit of my ADHD kicking in. But if you're a spouse that constantly threatens to divorce your spouse when you're fighting, you're not a safe person. If you threaten divorce when you're mad, you're not a safe person. And then what happens is the other person, rather than calling that out repetitively, starts to manage it. And they start to avoid the hard conversation. And often they'll say to me, well, because I don't want to risk divorce. I usually point out they're risking divorce anyhow. This is why it's so important that we make sure that we accept reality as it is. This is why it's so important that we make sure that we're not trying to sugarcoat reality to ourselves. Because what happens is once we do that, once we back out of accepting reality as it is, and we think we're actually protecting the relationship rather than maybe living in the potential destruction of that relationship, we start to scam ourselves. We start to tell ourselves stories, right? It's not that big of a deal. They didn't mean it. It's just my issue. Now, here's the problem. I have to pause for a second and realize that sometimes those stories are true. Sometimes it really isn't that big of a deal. Sometimes they really didn't mean it. They were talking faster than their brain was processing. Sometimes it is just my issue. It's my own trauma triggering off in my brain. That happened this past week. My wife was on the phone with a friend of hers, and I heard the conversation. The friend was talking very loudly, and I felt anger rising up in me because of trauma that had been in my past. And I didn't do anything. I walked away from it, and it was fine. But that is true sometimes, but it's not always true. And when we're avoiding the hard conversation, we tend to default to these as the answer. And so often these can be fear wearing reasonable language. It can be us being afraid and dressing that fear up in something that is palatable to us, looking at it being like, okay, well, this would be acceptable. If I just said I'm afraid that I'm going to lose the relationship, somebody either would tell me that's not a good reason or they would call me out for it. And I don't want that, so I'm just going to dress it up in something that can't be called out. And that's kind of how we work sometimes, which then begs the question, what does silence do to relationships over time? If we regularly default to these stories, if we regularly choose silence over everything else, what happens to the very relationship that we're trying to protect? Because the problem is unspoken things don't disappear. They shape tone, they create distance, and they shape our behaviors. They don't go away. They just keep going. And the story I use typically is, imagine a person who has all the symptom of diabetes and they ignore them and they ignore them and they ignore them and they ignore them. Diabetes isn't going away. It's just continuing to cause damage to their body. I've used this story before. I had an employee who worked for me who was not very emotionally mature, and he had gotten way behind on his student loans. And they were calling him and he was ignoring them, and they would call him and he would ignore them, and they were calling him and he would ignore them. And eventually they just garnished his paycheck. And it was way worse than if he had just called them and worked out a payment plan. And I know this to be true because I actually said to him, why don't you just call them and work out a payment plan and tell them what you can afford and see if they'll work with you? And they did. How does this work in a relationship where we're constantly engaging in the silence? We're constantly trying to ignore what's going on. Well, what happens is you start editing yourself. And again, here's the thing. In the right dose, that's actually a good thing. In the right dosage, editing yourself can be a healthy choice. Not everything I think needs to be said. But if I'm constantly editing myself, I'm probably not around people that I can actually call friends, because friends are able to engage in the hard conversations. You stop asking. If you're editing yourself, you're not going to ask. You're not going to invite. You're done with the invitations and the asking. And I don't mean like you're inviting them out to dinner, which is fine and all that. But you stop inviting them to more. You stop asking them to more in themselves so that the relationship could be better. In short, really what you do is you stop risking. You stop taking any risk because you don't know how they're going to respond. And you've also, this is the part you have to own, you've also conditioned your brain, you and I, we've conditioned our brain to not want to risk it. And so what happens is eventually the relationship starts to feel flat. It starts to feel fragile because it is both of those things. But everyone's like, oh, I don't know why. I don't know why. And the relationship starts to diminish. And as it starts to diminish, we get to a part where it's not really a relationship. It's more the husk of a relationship. It's more a shell of a relationship. And we've lost the very thing that we thought we were trying to protect by avoiding the hard conversations. Not because we didn't love each other. It wasn't love that died. It was honesty that died. And I cannot tell you how often I see this when I sit in a therapy room with couples on the verge of divorce. They loved each other at one point, and the first thing to die was honesty and graciousness and kindness and all of the things that make a good, hard conversation a good, hard conversation. And this is probably a good spot to step back and ask ourselves then, okay, well, what does a good, hard conversation look like? What does a healthy, hard conversation look like? And part of it is what are we aiming for? And I see that, again, I don't mean to make this all about couples counseling, because if you're not in a relationship, then you don't care about this. Or if this isn't your relationship, you might not care about it. But there are other areas of your life where this is something you have to consider. The aim of a healthy, hard conversation is not to win, not to punish. It's not to control the outcome. It's clarity and alignment and some sort of solution, right? And this is where we use terms that don't help us. Well, we have to we have to compromise. And I'll say, okay, well, what does compromise mean? Well, we have to meet in the middle. Well, okay, well, what does that mean? Typically, a better definition of compromise is the idea that not everybody gets everything that they want, and very few people, and no one gets everything that they want, and everybody gets a little bit of what they don't want. Boy, man, I said that so goofy. Let's say that one more time. Nobody gets everything that they want, and everybody gets a little bit of what they don't want. Because if the goal is just to get what I want, then there's no real conversation. It's just, I'm giving you my terms, and you can decide if you're going to participate or not. If it's actually clarity, alignment, and solutions, what we're saying is this matters, and I'm willing to risk the discomfort to be real with you. What we're actually saying is you matter to me more than the potential fallout of what could happen if we don't have this conversation. If my doctor gives me a bad diagnosis and tells me, hey, this is really unhealthy for you, they care more about my health than they do about my happiness. Because what they're saying is if you're not healthy, you can't really be happy, right? We don't want to overstate that. But still, we're not going after aggression here. We're going after maturity. We're not going after, I'm going to beat you into agreeing with me. Now, here's the thing. We might be passionate about it. I might get excited. You might get excited. That's okay. We have to have those guidelines. I was just talking to a guy this morning. We were talking about what are the guidelines of how we have hard conversations. And I gave him my 4 gateways. Is it necessary? Is it true? Is it kind? Is it helpful? Coupled with the 6 rules, be intentional, avoid universals. Does it have to be a problem? Facts, not what I think, right? Facts only. Issues, not people. Today's news. And when I can take those 4 gateways with those 6 rules and I put them together, I can have a difficult conversation, because what I'm doing is, as I'm inviting the person that I'm having the difficult conversation with into a deeper, more intimate relationship, which is the goal of why I'm doing this. If I don't want it to go deeper, if I don't want it to be more intimate, and I want it to stay just where it's at, that's fine. But that's usually how we define stagnant. And stagnant relationships are rarely healthy. I would be remiss to not admit and bring into this conversation today that sometimes silence is appropriate. Not every thought needs to be voiced. Not every that is voiced needs to be confronted. Silence can actually be wise. Maybe you need time to regulate before you speak. Maybe the issue is about what's going on inside of you and has nothing to do with the other person, and you need time to space that out and work through that. Maybe the relationship doesn't have the capacity for the conversation. Now, this is one that, if this is the case, we have to really back out and ask ourselves, why not? Why doesn't this relationship have the ability to have this conversation? And how much of that do I control? How much of that do I need to talk to the other person about? Because if it's somebody that's in my intimate circle, I probably should have our relationship should have the capacity to have any hard conversation. Because anytime we use silence to avoid fear or a fear, we're not actually being intentional. We're being controlled by fear. And if we're being controlled by fear, we're not building healthy relationships. Healthy relationships are not built on fear. Unhealthy relationships are built on fear, guilt, and those types of things. I often call this the what and the why. What? I'm choosing to be silent. Why? When we can answer that why, and it's not to avoid fear, but it's because of any of the reasons we listed above, or maybe something that I didn't list, but that you decide is something that is actually moving the relationship to healthy, that's called decisions that lead you, and wisdom is its own reward. But if we're choosing to avoid fear, we're probably eroding the emotional stability of the relationship. Because peace bought with silence is fragile. It's fragile. It requires more silence to be peace. And it can only last as long as nothing else goes wrong. And that just isn't how our life works. Something's always going to go wrong. Hard conversations cost courage up front. You have to have the courage to engage in it. You have to have the courage to kind of wrestle with it. And I've been there, right? Like, I remember one time a friend of mine made a statement about his brother who was a pastor, and I remember chewing on it for like 3-4 days. And I was like, I just don't agree with that. And the way the conversation went, I know he walked away from that thinking that I did actually agree with him. So I sent him, I think, a Marco Polo at the time. I was like, hey, I've been thinking about this. And I mean, I was scared. But I was like, I've got to follow up with this statement that you made. And it took courage to do that. It was scary. But avoidance will not only cost you integrity over time, it will often cost you the very relationship that you think you're trying to protect. Because if you want relationships that can handle difficult things, you have to be willing to speak about the difficult things. You have to give it an opportunity to build its muscles via the push-ups of engaging in difficult conversations. Because if you don't, the silence starts doing the talking and walking for you. I just can't tell you that. I can't stress that enough. If you don't engage in the conversation, silence will talk for you and will often introduce unhealthiness into the relationship. All right, so that's today's episode. I hope that you found it helpful. I hope that this is something that maybe will give you some guidelines to consider and how you decide, are you going to engage in a hard conversation or not? Thanks so much for listening. We'll catch you next week.
Thanks for listening. If you enjoyed today's show, please share with a friend. And hey, give us that rating in your podcast store. Until next time, change possible.